Okay, so picture this scene.
Hmm.
Let's say it's 2008. You walk into one of those coffee shops that were just popping up everywhere.
Oh, yeah. The ones with the single Edison bulb hanging over every table.
Exactly. You know, the place exposed brick, maybe some reclaimed wood. It smells like burnt coffee and, I don't know, ambition. And you're in, like, Portland or East Nashville, some super trendy part of a city.
The whole vibe, I can picture it perfectly.
Right. And you see a guy in the corner. He's probably in his early 20s. He's got the uniform on, the skinny jeans, the flannel shirt that cost way too much.
Maybe a carefully unkempt beard.
Yes, a beard that says, I don't care. But it took him 45 minutes to sculpt. He's got a pour-over coffee in front of him that took like 10 minutes to brew.
Yeah.
He fits the archetype perfectly.
He's the poster child for the late 2000s hipster.
100%. But then you look a little closer, you glance over his shoulder to see what he's reading, and it's not some cool indie magazine, it's not Kerouac.
Wow.
It's this absolute brick of a book. Leather-bound, super dense text, and the English is all archaic. It's some theological treatise by a Puritan dude who died in the 1600s.
Something like John Owen's The Death of Death and the Death of Christ.
Yes, a title that you have to read 3 times to even understand. And this guy, this hipster, he isn't just, skimming it. He's got highlighters out. He's got a Moleskine notebook. He is deep in the weeds of 17th century Calvinist theology.
It was such a strange collision of worlds.
Yeah.
I mean, the aesthetic of postmodern, cool, smashing headfirst into the rigid, absolute theology of the Reformation.
It was a total paradox. And the thing is, it wasn't just one guy. This was a whole movement. You had thousands, maybe millions of young people in the mid-2000s who just fell in love with Calvinism.
They were loading up their iPods. Remember the click wheel?
Oh, I remember.
They were loading them up with like 2-hour-long sermons on the sovereignty of God, not little sound bites. Deep, dense exposition.
They were getting tattoos of the reformers. I mean, can you imagine getting a tattoo of John Calvin's face on your bicep? A guy in a funny hat and a big beard from 400 years ago.
It was a legitimate phenomenon. And it got a name. The Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, or, New Calvinism for short.
And that's our deep dive for today. But I want to be really clear from the start. This isn't just a niche history lesson for people who are into theology.
No, not at all.
Even if you don't care about predestination or church history, it's a fascinating case study in what happens when ancient ideas meet modern culture and technology. It's about how movements are built and how they fall apart.
It's one of the most significant things to happen in North American evangelicalism in the last 30 years, without a doubt. And our main guide for this discussion is a text called The Unfinished Reformation, which really tracks the whole arc of this thing.
Right. It looks at the rise, the incredible peak, and then the pretty dramatic fall and fragmentation that we're still seeing the effects of today.
And it has a central thesis that I think is just fascinating. The argument is that the movement did a great job of recovering the soteriology of the Reformation.
Soteriology.
Yeah.
That's the doctrine of salvation, right? How you get saved.
Exactly. They recovered that part, but they almost completely failed to recover the ecclesiology.
The doctrine of the church, what the church is, how it's supposed to function.
Right. So they had this incredibly powerful, ancient theological content, but they tried to pour it into a very modern, fragile, celebrity-driven container.
And when you do that, the container is going to crack.
It eventually shatters under the pressure.
So let's start at the beginning, the context. To understand why this explosion happened, you really have to look at what came before it. Why were young people in, say, 2005 so thirsty for this heavy, ancient stuff? What was the landscape of the 90s that created such a vacuum?
Well, you have to understand the diet they were raised on to understand why they were starving. The evangelical world of the 1980s and 90s, especially in the American suburbs, was just dominated by one thing: the church growth movement.
The megachurch era. You're thinking of guys like Bill Hybels and Rick Warren.
Exactly. Willow Creek, Saddleback. And the guiding principle was methodological pragmatism. It was all about results.
What does that mean, methodological pragmatism?
It basically means whatever works to get people in the door, let's do it. The logic was the traditional church was, scary and off-putting to outsiders.
Too weird. The organ music, the stained glass, the robes.
The scary words like sin and hell and wrath. It was all seen as a barrier to entry for this seeker, the unchurched person they were trying to reach.
So the goal became to lower that barrier as much as possible.
They bulldozed it.
Mm-hmm.
The churches started to look less like churches and more like, a corporate conference center or a nice community college campus.
With a food court and a bookstore.
Right. And the music changed. It started sounding like the soft rock you'd hear on the radio, very polished, very non-threatening. And the sermons, that was the biggest change.
Yeah, the sermon shifted from "Thus saith the Lord" to what?
To 5 ways to improve your marriage, or how to manage stress in a hectic world. It was very practical, very how-to.
It was self-help with a Bible verse tacked on at the end.
That's a cynical way to put it, but it's not entirely wrong. It was very therapeutic.
Yeah.
And the God that was presented in that era, he was often described as a cosmic therapist or a distant butler.
A butler.
Yeah. He's there to meet your felt needs. If you feel lonely, God is your friend. If you feel anxious, God brings you peace. If your life is a mess, God will help you clean it up. He exists to make your life run more smoothly.
Now, those things aren't necessarily untrue, are they? I mean, Christianity does speak to loneliness and anxiety.
Of course, but it's a question of what's primary. Is God a sovereign king to be worshipped who also brings peace? Or is God a cosmic vending machine for peace? The emphasis was all on what God could do for me.
There's a really important term for this that some sociologists came up with, and it perfectly describes this whole religious atmosphere: moralistic therapeutic deism.
Yes, from Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist-Denton. It's such a brilliant phrase because it just nails it. They studied teenagers in the early 2000s and found that this was the default religion of America, no matter what denomination they were part of.
Okay, so let's break that down, because each word is important. Moralistic.
Moralistic just means that the core of religion is about being a good person. Be nice. Be fair. Don't be a jerk. It's basically the golden rule, but sort of stripped of any divine command or theological foundation. It's just a general niceness.
And then therapeutic?
That's the part we were just talking about. The central goal of life, and therefore religion, is to be happy and to feel good about yourself.
Yeah.
God isn't there to make demands on you or call you to holiness. He's there to affirm you and help you with your problems so you can achieve self-actualization.
He's a tool for your personal well-being.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the last part is the kicker: deism.
Which means God is distant.
Right. A deist believes that God created the world, he set up the moral laws, and he kind of watches from a distance. But he's not actively involved in your day-to-day life unless you have a big problem and you need to call on him.
He's the butler. You ring the bell when the plumbing breaks, but otherwise he stays out of the way.
That's the perfect analogy. So you have this entire generation, the millennials, who are being raised in youth groups where they're playing games with shaving cream and hearing these little talks about being nice and how God wants them to be happy.
And it's all very shallow. It's a mile wide and an inch deep.
Incredibly shallow. And then something happens. They went to college. Or 9/11 happens. The world suddenly feels very serious, very dark, and very uncertain.
And the butler God doesn't seem big enough to handle that.
Not even close. The therapeutic platitudes feel empty when you're facing real existential dread. They started to sniff out the inauthenticity of it all.
That's a good point. This is the generation that was marketed to from the moment they were born. They have a finely tuned BS detector.
A very high one. And the 90s seeker-sensitive church, with its desperate attempt to be relevant and cool, it just reeked of inauthenticity.
Because nothing is less cool than trying too hard to be cool.
It's the cardinal rule of cool. So what did they do? They went looking for the exact opposite. They didn't want a church that felt like a rock concert. They wanted something that felt ancient. They didn't want a God who was their buddy. They wanted a God who was holy and transcendent and, frankly, a little bit scary.
They were looking for weight, for substance.
He wanted a God who was big, a God who was sovereign over the chaos they were seeing in the world. There's a strange comfort in the idea of a God who is in complete control, even when your life feels completely out of control.
So that's the vacuum. They were spiritually starving. And then into that vacuum comes this big God theology.
Yes. The new Calvinism was the absolute perfect antidote to moralistic therapeutic deism. It presented a God who was not a therapist, but a king. A God who was holy, sovereign, and whose primary goal was not your happiness, but his own glory.
And somehow that was appealing.
It was deeply appealing because it felt real. It took the world's darkness seriously. It took their own sins seriously. It didn't just pat them on the head and say, be nice. It said, you are a sinner, and you are in need of radical grace from a holy God. And that resonated.
There was this one sentence, a mantra, really, from John Piper that I think captured the heart of this whole thing.
I know exactly the one you're talking about.
God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him.
That sentence was revolutionary for so many people. Piper called it Christian hedonism, And it was the bridge that connected everything.
But so, what did it bridge?
It bridged the gap between that deep, heavy, intellectual Puritan theology and a real, passionate, emotional experience. It told them that the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of joy were not enemies. They were the same thing.
So it wasn't just about being a brainiac who knows a bunch of doctrines. It made theology feel vital. Like your personal happiness depends on you understanding who God is.
Yes. It gave them permission to be intellectually rigorous and emotionally passionate. It wasn't cold, dead orthodoxy. It was alive. It had a heartbeat.
Okay, so we have the hunger and we have the food that satisfies the hunger. But how did the food get to the table? I mean, theological movements usually spread through institutions, right? Seminaries, denominations, publishing houses.
They do, historically. But this was different. This was, you could argue, the first theological movement that was fueled almost entirely by the internet.
The MP3 Reformation.
You absolutely cannot understand the rise of New Calvinism without understanding the rise of broadband internet and the MP3 player.
It's so funny to think about now, an MP3 player being revolutionary, but it really was.
It was a total game changer.
Yeah.
It was the democratization of theological education. Think about it. Before, say, the year 2000, if you wanted to get deep theological teaching, what were your options?
You had to go to seminary. Or you had to have enough money to buy a massive library of very expensive books.
Right. You were limited by geography, by access, by money. But suddenly, in the early 2000s, a college kid could sit in their dorm room and download, for free, the entire sermon archive of someone like John Piper or Tim Keller.
And this created a massive shift in where people got their authority from.
A seismic shift. It meant that a young, eager Christian could completely bypass their local pastor.
That's a huge point. Let's say your local pastor gives a perfectly fine, but maybe uninspiring 20-minute sermon on Sunday about being a good neighbor.
A classic, moralistic, therapeutic deism sermon.
Right. And you go home and you can immediately listen to a 90-minute masterclass exposition of the book of Romans by a world-class scholar and preacher.
Who are you going to listen to? Who is going to have more influence on your spiritual development?
It's not even a contest.
It's not. And it created this terrible comparison trap for local pastors. They couldn't possibly compete with the production value, the eloquence, and the sheer intellectual firepower of the super apostles on the podcast.
And it also created what the source material calls a virtual denomination.
Yeah, that's a great term for it. It was built through blogs. Remember when blogs were everything?
Oh, yeah, the blogosphere.
You had these central hubs like John Piper's Desiring God or the Gospel Coalition, which was a collection of these big-name pastors. And they created a shared identity. It didn't matter if you were a Baptist in Alabama or a non-denominational church planter in Seattle. If you read those blogs and listened to those podcasts, you were part of the tribe.
The influence flowed directly from the celebrity at the top to the individual consumer at the bottom. It just skipped over the whole middle layer of denominations and local church structures.
And that, right there, is the first major crack in the container we talked about at the beginning. The authority structure wasn't local. It was digital and personality-driven. So we have the context, we have the delivery mechanism. Let's dig into the architecture. What did these guys actually believe? Because reformed is a big word with a lot of historical baggage. It is. And this is where it starts to get contentious. The rallying point, the flag they all flew, was the 5 points of Calvinism, famously known by the acronym TULIP.
Okay, let's just quickly list them. TULIP stands for
total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
We don't need to do a whole seminary class on this, but just think about that first one for a second. Total depravity.
Right, which basically means that human beings are sinful to their core and are fundamentally unable to save themselves.
On the surface, that sounds incredibly depressing. Why would a 20-year-old in skinny jeans find that attractive?
Because it felt brutally honest. It was the ultimate anti-therapy message. The culture was telling them, you're good, you're special, believe in yourself. And they looked at the world, and they looked at their own hearts, and they knew that wasn't true.
It validated their own cynicism about the world and themselves.
It did. It said, no, you're right. The world is deeply broken, and the reason it's broken is because we are deeply broken. It was an explanation for the darkness that felt more real than the shallow optimism they'd been fed.
It's like the appeal in the movie Fight Club or something, acknowledging the rot at the core of things.
That's a great comparison.
Yeah.
But here's where the architecture gets really clever and also where the problems start. This movement wasn't one denomination. It was a coalition.
Right. You had hardcore Baptists like Al Mohler, the head of the Southern Baptist Seminary. You had Presbyterians like Tim Keller in New York City. You even had charismatics like Mark Driscoll in Seattle.
And historically, those groups do not get along.
Not at all. I mean, Baptists and Presbyterians have been arguing about who to baptize for 500 years.
And everybody thought the charismatics were weird. So how did they all get on the same stage at the same conference, promoting each other's books?
How did they build that big tent?
They employed a strategy that Al Mohler famously called theological triage.
Like in a hospital emergency room.
Exactly. When you have a mass casualty event, the surgeons have to sort the patients. Who needs immediate surgery to live? Who has a broken arm that can wait? Who has a scrape that just needs a bandage? They applied that logic to theology.
Okay, so walk us through the tiers. What's a tier 1 issue?
Tier 1 issues are the life-threatening injuries. These are the absolute core of the Christian faith. If we disagree here, one of us isn't a Christian, we're not on the same team.
So this is like the Trinity, the deity of Christ.
Yes, the essentials. And for this movement, they put Calvinistic soteriology, the two little P points, in tier 1. They saw it as central to the gospel itself.
So tier 1 is the theological bunker. If you don't agree on this stuff, you can't even get in the door.
That's a good way to put it. Then you have tier 2. These are the serious injuries, but they're not immediately fatal. These are what they call ecclesial issues.
So church issues, like baptism.
Right. Who do you baptize and how? Or church government. Should the church be run by elders or by the whole congregation? Or the details of the Lord's Supper. These are important, but they decided we can disagree on them and still be brothers in Christ.
So you can be a Baptist or a Presbyterian, and you're still on the same team. You just go to different local churches. You can't be in the same local church, but you can share a conference stage.
Precisely. We can't do church together on Sunday, but we can co-author a book. And then you have tier 3. These are the scrapes and bruises.
Things like musical style in worship, or what you believe about the end times.
Exactly. Stuff where there's a huge range of legitimate Christian opinion. These are matters of preference or secondary interpretation.
And as a strategy for building a movement, it was brilliant.
It was absolute genius. It allowed them to create this massive, unified front. It consolidated their influence in publishing, conferences, and church planting. But it had a fatal flaw baked into its DNA. By relegating ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, to tier 2, they sent a powerful message. They effectively said, how the church is structured and how it functions in the real world is secondary. It's less important than the abstract doctrines of salvation.
And I'm guessing the old school traditional Calvinists were not happy about this.
Oh, they were furious. The source talks about critics like R. Scott Clark, who accused the movement of theological vandalism.
Yeah, vandalism is a strong word.
It is. But their argument was pretty simple. They said, you can't just raid the Reformed tradition like it's a buffet, picking the parts you like, the big God, the predestination, and leaving the rest on the table.
What were they leaving behind?
For the historic Reformed tradition, being Reformed wasn't just about tulip. It was a comprehensive worldview. It included a very specific way to govern the church, a specific view of the sacraments, a specific understanding of the covenant that included baptizing the children of believers. It was a whole system.
But the new Calvinists were essentially redefining Reformed to just mean, I'm an evangelical, I'm serious about my theology, and I believe in predestination.
Exactly. It was a minimalist definition that allowed their coalition to work. But the critics said they are gutting the term of its historical, and especially its ecclesial, meaning they were taking the content but ditching the container.
So this gets us back to that core thesis. They recovered the doctrine of justification, but they missed the importance of sanctification and ecclesiology. Let's talk about that sanctification deficit.
Yeah, this is a subtle but really important point. Sanctification is the process of becoming more holy, more like Christ. And you'd think a movement so obsessed with theology would be great at this.
It seems counterintuitive that they wouldn't be.
It does. But it came from their intense reaction against the 90s. They were so terrified of moralism, that just be a good person, Christianity, that they swung the pendulum way to the other side. They championed radical grace, which is the true and wonderful doctrine that you are saved and accepted by God based purely on what Christ has done for you, not on your own performance or good works.
Okay, that's just basic Protestant doctrine. What's the problem?
The problem isn't the doctrine itself. The problem is one of emphasis. When you preach only radical grace, and you constantly downplay or even mock the importance of biblical commands, obedience, and personal effort in holiness, you risk creating something called antinomianism.
Which means against the law.
Yeah, lawlessness.
Yeah.
It created a culture where if you talk too much about rules or duty or spiritual disciplines, You were looked at as being a legalist. It felt unspiritual. The spiritual thing to do was just rest in grace.
So you could have this massive theological intellect, but a very messy, undisciplined personal life.
And it was often excused under the banner of being authentic or not a legalist. And this ties into another problem, the gospel issues trap.
I've heard this phrase so much. This issue is a gospel issue.
Right. This is a direct consequence of the triage system. Because the only things that truly mattered, the only things that united them, were the Tier 1 gospel issues. So if you wanted to make a strong point about something, you had to argue that it was a gospel issue.
You had to cram it into Tier 1.
You had to. If you wanted to argue about a political position or a cultural trend or a social issue, you couldn't just say, I think this is the wise or biblical way to go. That's a Tier 2 or Tier 3 argument. To give it ultimate weight, you had to frame it as, if you disagree with me on this, you are compromising the gospel itself.
Wow. That raises the stakes on every single disagreement.
It turns everything into a test of fellowship. There's no room for nuance or charitable disagreement. You're not just wrong, you're a heretic who is betraying the gospel.
And that might work for a while when everyone is generally on the same page.
But the minute a truly divisive, complex issue comes along, that framework becomes a weapon for destroying the movement from the inside.
Man, you can just see the train wreck coming. Okay, let's shift to the structure of the movement, the ecclesiology. Where did this thing actually live and breathe? Because as you said, it wasn't really happening in the local church on Main Street.
No, this is what the source calls the parachurch problem. The spiritual center of gravity for the YRR movement was not the local congregation. It was the conference.
The big events, stadium spirituality.
Yes. Massive conferences like Together for the Gospel, or T4G, and the Passion Conferences, which drew tens of thousands of college students. You have to imagine the scene. You're in an arena with 20,000 other young, passionate people.
The production value is off the charts.
It's like a rock concert. The lights are amazing. The sound system is perfect. The bands are professional musicians playing these epic modern hymns. And then one of the celebrity pastors comes out on this huge stage and delivers this powerful, eloquent, thundering sermon.
It's a massive emotional experience. It feels significant. It feels like you're part of something huge.
It is. But it creates what sociologists call displacement. The primary location of your spiritual formation gets displaced from the local and ordinary to the spectacular and distant.
And this creates a kind of addiction, right? A conference spirituality.
Totally. You get hooked on that emotional high, that feeling of being in a massive crowd, that level of professional excellence. And then you go back home on Monday.
And you walk into your small local church where the pastor is a little awkward and the music is led by a volunteer on an out-of-tune guitar.
And it just feels lame.
Yes.
It feels small and boring and amateurish. It can't possibly compete with the experience you just had.
So this fostered a kind of free agent Christianity.
It absolutely did. It's the ultimate irony. The leaders preached against the consumerism of the 90s church, but the very structure of their movement was hyper-consumerist.
You picked the podcast you wanted to consume. You bought the books you liked. You paid to go to the conference that had your favorite speakers.
You were curating your own spiritual experience, consuming theological products without ever submitting to the messy, inconvenient reality of a local church community and its discipline.
And this produced a very specific and often infamous character type. We have to talk about the cage-stage Calvinist.
The cage stager, yes.
Explain the concept.
The idea, the joke, is that when a person first discovers the doctrines of Calvinism, they become so arrogant and argumentative and just generally obnoxious that for the good of the church, they should be locked in a cage for about 2 years until they calm down and mature a bit.
I think we've all met this person. He's usually a 19-year-old college student. He just read one book by R.C. Sproul, and now he's an expert.
And he is terrorizing his small group. He's correcting the pastor after the sermon. He's arguing with people on the internet all night.
He's the guy who walks up to this sweet elderly woman who has been faithfully serving in the church for 50 years and explains to her why her understanding of free will is theologically bankrupt.
It's theology as a hammer. And it comes directly from that displacement we talked about. His primary disciplers are the celebrity pastors on his iPod. He feels this sense of intimacy with them, but they have no idea who he is.
Meanwhile, his actual local pastor, the guy who would visit him in the hospital, is viewed as theologically inferior because he's not as eloquent as the guy on the podcast.
It created a generation of what someone called heads on sticks. They had these massive theological intellects, but often very little grace, humility, or relational wisdom. All data, no love.
And this points to a deeper, more structural problem that the source highlights, a fundamental confusion between a spiritual gift and a biblical office.
This is such a key insight. Let's break that down.
Okay, so what's the difference?
In the Bible, the role of a pastor or an elder is described as an office. It comes with a list of qualifications. Most of them are about character, being gentle, sober-minded, hospitable, managing your own family well. And it's a local relational job. You are called to shepherd a specific flock of people that you know.
Okay, so that's the office. What's the gift?
A gift would be something like being a talented public speaker or a brilliant writer. In the YRR movement, the lines got incredibly blurry. Pastor was often treated not as an office you're ordained to in a local church, but as a talent you have.
So if you can draw a huge crowd with your speaking, you are de facto a pastor with authority.
Exactly. Influence was confused with biblical authority. You had these guys who were amazing communicators. They were bloggers, authors, conference speakers, and they functioned with the authority of global pastors, but they often weren't submitted to any meaningful local church accountability.
If your local pastor sins, his local elders can remove him from office, but if a celebrity conference speaker who runs his own ministry messes up.
Who holds him accountable? His board of directors, who are often his hand-picked friends, his followers on Twitter. This lack of a real biblical accountability structure was a time bomb waiting to go off.
So let's talk more about that culture. The celebrity piece is huge here. The source calls it the idol of celebrity.
It's the central glaring paradox of the whole movement. You have a theology that is relentlessly focused on God's glory and human depravity. The core message is, God is everything, you are nothing. And yet the entire movement was built and sustained on the fame and charisma of a few human celebrities.
The big man problem.
Yeah. Figures like Mark Driscoll, John Piper, Matt Chandler, they became brands that became too big to fail. Their platform and their ministry's success became so important that it created a protective shield around them. To criticize the man was to be seen as attacking the mission itself.
And social media just poured gasoline on this whole fire, creating this sense of faux intimacy.
It really did. You follow a pastor on Twitter, you listen to his podcast every week, you read his blog, you feel like you know him, you feel like he's your mentor, your pastor. It's a parasocial relationship.
But he doesn't know you from Adam.
He doesn't. And that digital intimacy erodes your trust and respect for your local ordinary leaders. Why listen to your flawed normal pastor when you can get discipled by this perfect polished celebrity online?
There's another paradox that I find almost comical. The source calls it the Puritan paradox. This weird hybrid of Puritan theology and postmodern cool.
So someone once described it as the theological mullet. Puritan in the front, party in the back.
That's amazing. Unpack that. What did they take from the Puritans and what did they reject?
Okay, so they loved the Puritan soteriology, the big sovereign God, the doctrines of grace. They devoured that stuff. But they almost completely rejected the Puritan practice.
What does that mean?
Well, take worship, for example. The Puritans were famous for the regulative principle of worship, which basically says you should only do in worship what the Bible explicitly commands. So no musical instruments, no images, just simple singing of psalms. It was very austere.
And the YRR worship style was the opposite of that.
Absolute polar opposite. They wanted the smoke machines, the professional rock bands, the edgy graphic design, the U2 style anthems. They wanted the theology of the 17th century, but the aesthetics of a Brooklyn indie rock show.
And what about personal life? The Sabbath is a big one.
A huge one. For the Puritans, the Sabbath Sunday was a day of strict rest and worship. No unnecessary work, it was a holy day set apart. The YRR movement, on the other hand, was driven by this restless, missional activism.
The name itself, young, restless, and reformed.
It's right there in the title. They saw Sunday as just another opportunity for evangelism, for work, for redeeming the culture. They often viewed taking a Sabbath as a form of legalism.
So you have a movement of self-described restless people who reject the primary biblical mechanism for rest. What's the result of that?
Burnout. Massive burnout.
Yeah.
They had the Puritan work ethic, the drive, the discipline and study, but they didn't have the Puritan structures for rest and sustainability. It was all gas, no brakes, all grace, no law, ended up meaning no guardrails for their own lives.
It was style over substance, in a way.
I think so. They desperately wanted to prove that you could be theologically conservative and culturally cool at the same time. But the source makes the argument that in adopting the world's methods, the celebrity culture, the branding, the consumerism, they ended up becoming worldly in their form, even while they were claiming to be biblical in their content.
And that kind of hybrid system can only hold together for so long. Eventually, the pressure gets too high.
And the cracks that were there from the beginning start to become massive fissures.
Which brings us to the collapse. Let's talk about the fall and fragmentation. The source really pinpoints the period from 2014 onward as the time when it all started to unravel.
Yeah, the first really major earthquake that shook the whole movement was the collapse of Mars Hill Church in Seattle in 2014.
Mark Driscoll.
He was, in many ways, the ultimate icon of the movement. The edgy, cool, macho Calvinist. His church was enormous and incredibly influential. But in 2014, it all imploded spectacularly amidst a storm of accusations.
What kind of accusation?
Bullying, spiritual abuse, a domineering leadership style, plagiarism, misusing church funds to get his book on the bestseller list. It was a long and ugly list.
And this wasn't just seen as one famous pastor failing. It felt like an indictment of the whole system.
It was, because it exposed the profound lack of accountability we talked about. It showed the poison of that results at all costs, too big to fail mindset. People had overlooked the warning signs for years because the church was growing so fast. The fall of Mars Hill made everyone stop and ask, is this what our big God theology produces? Arrogant bullies. It casts a very long shadow.
Okay, so that's 2014. Then 2 years later, another earthquake hits, the 2016 election.
The Trump era. This just shattered the unspoken political consensus of the movement.
What was that consensus?
Before 2016, it was generally assumed that if you were in this tribe, you were a political conservative, but, you know, a thoughtful, principled, winsome conservative.
But Donald Trump was not that. He forced a choice.
He was a wrecking ball to that consensus. And the movement fractured right down the middle. On one side, you had leaders who prioritized political power and saw Trump as a necessary, if flawed, vehicle to achieve conservative ends, maybe even drifting toward a kind of Christian nationalism.
And on the other side,
You had leaders who were appalled, who believed that character, integrity, and public witness were far more important, and that supporting Trump was a catastrophic compromise of that witness. The theological triage framework had no answer for this. Was your vote a Tier 1 gospel issue or a Tier 3 issue of prudential judgment? No one could agree.
but according to the source, that wasn't even the final blow. The real kill shot that ended the Coalition for Good came in 2018.
Yes, the social justice fracture. This, more than anything else, was the moment the young, restless, and reformed ceased to exist as a coherent, unified movement. The debate over race, privilege, and justice blew it apart.
Okay, so let's try to map out the two sides here, because this is where the triage system just completely implodes on itself.
It does. So, broadly speaking, you had what we can call Side A. This included figures like Thabiti Anyabwile, Tim Keller, and Russell Moore. Their argument, essentially, was that the gospel has undeniable social implications.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that if you truly believe the gospel, you must care about justice for the oppressed. To ignore issues like systemic racism is to deny the image of God in your neighbor. Therefore, for them, fighting for social justice wasn't an optional extra. It was a gospel issue.
So they elevated it to Tier 1. It became part of the bunker.
Exactly. But now look at Side B. This included figures like John MacArthur and Vadi Baucham. Their argument was that the modern social justice movement was a Trojan horse for unbiblical secular ideologies like Marxism and critical race theory.
So a different gospel.
A different gospel.
Yeah.
They argued that embracing these ideas was a denial of the sufficiency of Scripture, that it was adding secular works to the gospel of grace. Therefore, for them, rejecting social justice as defined by the culture was a gospel issue.
So both sides put their position in Tier 1.
And boom, that's the end of the game. The triage system collapses. When both sides of a debate define their position as a non-negotiable Tier 1 gospel issue, there's no middle ground left. There's no agree to disagree. There's only separation.
And it got ugly.
It got very ugly. You had the Dallas Statement on Social Justice in 2018, which drew a hard line in the sand, essentially calling the other side's views a dangerous compromise. The friendships fractured. The conference partnerships dissolved.
The institutions themselves started to crumble.
They did. Together for the Gospel, the flagship conference of the movement, held its final gathering in 2022. The name had become ironic. They simply weren't together anymore. Other networks like Acts 29 were plagued by repeated scandals. The institutional center could not hold.
And what happened to the actual young people who'd grown up in this movement?
It was a shattering experience for many. A huge number of them deconstructed their faith entirely. This is where you get a large part of the evangelical movement. They felt disillusioned and betrayed by the hypocrisy, the celebrity worship, the political tribalism. They were sold a beautiful, robust theology, but the behavior of the leaders didn't match. So they walked away from all of it.
And others went in the opposite direction.
Right. Others reacted by doubling down, retreating into an even more rigid, often isolated form of fundamentalism, building the walls of the bunker even higher.
So we're left standing in the rubble of what was once this massive, influential movement. Let's do the analysis. Why did it ultimately fail? The source argues it failed to recover the full gospel. What does that mean?
It goes back to the container. The source argues that the movement suffered from anthropological thinness.
That's a mouthful. What is anthropological thinness?
Anthropology is the doctrine of humanity. What are human beings? How do we relate to one another in society? The movement's theology was very big God, which is great, but it was almost entirely vertical focused on the relationship between the individual sinner and God. It didn't have a well-developed, robust theology for the horizontal, how human beings are supposed to live together in community and society. So when these huge, complex social issues like race and identity politics erupted,
They didn't have the theological tools to handle it. Their only tool was a hammer that said, just preach the gospel. But the gospel, while essential, isn't a detailed blueprint for racial reconciliation or political theory. They lacked the categories to have a nuanced conversation, so they just retreated to their Tier 1 bunkers and started launching grenades.
and the triage system itself proved to be a failure in a polarized world.
A catastrophic failure. It turns out, in a culture at war over identity, you can't just call things like justice and ecclesiology second-order issues. In practice, they function as first-order dividers. How you treat your neighbor is not a secondary issue. And the source even argues that, in a weird way, the movement became a kind of MTD 2.0.
A new version of moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a harsh critique, but there's something to it. The promise of Christian hedonism, that satisfying yourself in God is the goal, can, if you're not careful, just become a more theological version of self-help.
I'm pursuing deep theology because the feeling of intellectual mastery and emotional passion it gives me is what I'm really after.
Precisely. It can become just another consumer product for the self, just dressed up in Puritan language instead of 90s pop psychology. It was still about my experience, my satisfaction, my theological tribe.
That is a sobering analysis, but we should be balanced here. Was it all a failure? Surely some good came out of it.
Oh, absolutely. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The movement as a cohesive cultural force is over, but its legacy is significant and not all of it is bad.
For one, the publishing world was transformed.
Completely. Crossway became a major publisher. They reprinted a ton of old Puritan works. There are millions of deep, theologically rich books in circulation now that simply weren't accessible before. A whole generation learned to read serious theology. That's not going away.
And the standard of preaching in many churches went way up.
Without a doubt. You now have a whole generation of pastors in their 30s and 40s who were trained in this movement, and they know how to do verse-by-verse expository preaching. They're actually teaching the Bible, not just giving 3 points in a poem. That is a massive positive shift from the shallow pragmatism of the 90s.
So if the young and restless phase is over, where has the energy gone? What's next?
The source suggests that the movement is shifting from being young and restless to being old and settled.
Old and settled. That sounds less exciting, but maybe more stable.
I think that's exactly the point. The energy is moving away from the spectacular, the mega conference, the celebrity pastor, and back toward the local and the ordinary. The future seems to belong to a renewed confessionalism.
Confessionalism, meaning a return to the historic creeds and confessions of the church.
Right. The Apostles' Creed, the Westminster Confession. Things that are standardized, tested by time, and don't depend on the charisma or genius of one individual leader. Things that are, frankly, a little bit boring.
Boring can be good. Boring is durable.
Exactly. The great lesson of the YRR's collapse seems to be that real, lasting spiritual revival probably doesn't come from a new podcast, a cooler brand, or a bigger conference. It comes from the slow, patient, ordinary means of grace.
Communion, baptism, the weekly sermon, singing together.
All the boring, repetitive weekly habits that the YRR movement, in its restlessness, was often too impatient to sit still for.
It's the difference between a firework display and a hearth fire.
That's the perfect way to put it. The YRR was a spectacular fireworks show. It was loud, it was brilliant, got everyone's attention. But it's over in a flash, and it leaves behind a lot of smoke. You can't warm your house with a firework.
For that, you need the hearth, the steady, quiet, slow-burning fire that lasts through the long winter.
And I think that's where the survivors of this movement are now gathering. Back around the old, boring but life-giving hearth of the local church.
So as we wrap up, here's the final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We've talked all this time about the content and the container. The question is, can you really have one without the other?
Can you take the fiery content of Puritan theology and pour it into a container that isn't the Puritans' deep commitment to the local church, discipline, and accountability? What do you end up with? Maybe just a head full of doctrines and a life that's still restless and fragmented.
It makes you wonder if we're all a bit too focused on being influencers or following our favorite influencers online, and not focused enough on just being faithful members of a local church.
Yeah. I mean, are you building your Christian life on a curated playlist of podcasts or on a tangible community of flawed people who actually know you? Because when your life falls apart, your favorite podcaster isn't going to show up at the hospital.
And maybe the cure for being restless isn't to find the next big, exciting thing. Maybe it's to finally learn how to sit still.
A truly radical thought in our age.
Thanks for going on this deep dive with us. We'll talk to you next time.